May 1813. A young man stands at the north end of Main Street in Concord, New Hampshire, 1 month before his 21st birthday. Lewis Downing has arrived from Lexington, Massachusetts, with $60 in his pocket, a set of wheelwright's tools valued at less than $100, and a skill that will transform the American West. The air smells of sawdust and horse manure. Around him, Concord hums with the rhythms of early 19th century commerce. Wagons clatter over cobblestones, merchants shout prices. Stage drivers complain loudly about the bone-jarring torture of their vehicles, about coaches that break down on rutted roads, about passengers who arrive at their destinations bruised and miserable. Downing listens. He sets up shop near the upper bank, working entirely alone that first year. By November, he has completed his first Concord wagon, every component fashioned by hand, without power machinery. The work is meticulous. He shapes each spoke, fits each wheel, tests every joint. What he does not yet know is that his attention to detail will create an industry, that the coaches bearing his town's name will carry gold and mail and desperate passengers across 2,000 miles of hostile territory, that his design will become so synonymous with westward expansion that a century later, people will still recognize the silhouette of a Concord stagecoach as the very symbol of the American frontier. This is a story about engineering and economics, about how a suspended box of ash and oak conquered the West before the railroad ever crossed it. It is a story measured in miles and tonnage and dollars, in the weight of leather thorough braces and the cost of a single coach in a time when a worker earned $1 per day. The mythology of the Wild West is drenched in violence and lawlessness, but the reality was more prosaic and more interesting. It was about logistics. It was about a manufacturing company in New Hampshire that built vehicles so well they could survive roads that would shatter any European coach. It was about the marriage of wheelwright precision and bodybuilding artistry, about immigrant craftsmen and assembly line discipline decades before Henry Ford. It was about Wells Fargo ordering 30 coaches in October 1867 and those red and gold vehicles leaving Concord on a train in April 1868 bound for Omaha to service 4,000 miles of stagecoach routes. The Concord coach did not tame the West through firepower. It tamed the West through suspension. Between 1848 and 1869, more than 250,000 people traveled the California Trail to the gold fields. And after the initial wagon train years, many of them made part of that journey in stagecoaches. The coaches carried not just passengers, but the infrastructure of commerce itself. Mail traveled in locked leather boots. Gold dust and bullion rode in green treasure boxes bolted beneath the driver's seat, each box weighing between 100 and 150 pounds when loaded. Express companies like Wells Fargo built their reputations on the reliable transport of these boxes across landscapes where roads were suggestions scratched into dirt, where river crossings could drown a team, where mountain passes closed for months every winter. The stagecoach was not romantic transportation. It was industrial logistics applied to an undeveloped continent. The question this episode examines is not whether the Concord coach was comfortable, though by the standards of its time it was, but how it worked, why it succeeded, and what its success reveals about the American economy in the decades before transcontinental rails. We will trace the manufacturing process in Concord's 6-acre factory, follow the coaches west on flatbed rail cars, and document their working lives on routes where a single day's travel could span 115 miles. We will examine the economics of stagecoach operation, the costs that broke small companies and made fortunes for others. We will look at the robberies not as gunslinger melodrama, but as a predictable outcome of transporting liquid wealth through isolated territory. And we will track the decline, the moment when steam locomotives made even the finest horse-drawn coaches obsolete, when the last Wells Fargo stage carrying cargo ran in 1909 between Tonopah and Manhattan, Nevada. California in 1848 existed in profound isolation from the rest of the United States. When President William Henry Harrison died in 1841, the news took 110 days to reach Los Angeles. By land, California was still 2,000 miles from the existing western frontier. The only alternatives to overland travel were by sea, either around Cape Horn, a voyage that could take 6 months, or by steamship to Panama, then across the isthmus, then another steamship north to San Francisco. Both routes were expensive, dangerous, and slow. The discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill on January the 24th, 1848, changed everything. By 1850, California's population had exploded to 92,500 residents, most of them recent arrivals. A decade later, the 1860 census recorded 380,000 people. These numbers represented an economic miracle and a logistical nightmare. How do you move people, mail, and wealth across a landscape with virtually no infrastructure? The answer for 2 decades was stagecoaches. The Butterfield Overland Mail, established in 1858, operated a route of approximately 2,800 miles from Missouri to San Francisco. The southern route crossed to Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and Southern California, deliberately avoiding the Rocky Mountains and Sierra Nevada to maintain year-round operation. 200 relay stations were established. Over 1,500 horses and mules provided the pulling power. 800 workers maintained stations, cared for animals, and guarded shipments. 250 coaches, most of them lighter celerity wagons rather than the heavier Concord coaches, serviced the route. The operation required capital on a scale few companies could muster without government mail contracts. Passengers paid $200, roughly 6 months' wages for a laborer, for the privilege of 24 days of nearly continuous travel. The Butterfield stages averaged 115 miles per 24-hour day. By contrast, the shorter but more mountainous Central Overland route, which later became the primary route after the Civil War began, managed about 80 miles per day. These were not comfortable journeys. Passengers sat upright for days, sleeping in their seats if they slept at all. Relay stations offered fresh horses and drivers, but rarely had adequate facilities for feeding or housing a full coach of passengers. The roads, such as they were, consisted of wagon ruts, river crossings, and stretches of open desert where drivers navigated by landmarks. In southern Arizona alone, it took more than 4 days and 27 stage stops just to cross the territory. European coaches, built for the relatively smooth roads of England and France, could not survive these conditions. They used steel springs to suspend the coach body from the frame. On rough roads, steel springs transmitted every shock directly into the structure, jarring passengers and gradually destroying the coach itself. Metal fatigued, joints loosened, wheels cracked. The Concord coach solved this problem with leather. Lewis Downing established his wheelwright business in 1813 but did not build his first true coach until after 1826, when he expanded his operation to include blacksmithing, painting, and upholstery facilities. In 1825, he hired J. Stephen Abbott, a coach bodybuilder from Salem, Massachusetts. Abbott had apprenticed with Frothingham and Loring, learning the craft of body construction. The two men formed a partnership on January 1st, 1828, combining Downing's expertise in running gear with Abbott's knowledge of coach bodies. Their first Concord coach was sold to an inn in Salisbury, New Hampshire in 1827, even before the formal partnership. The timing matters. 1827 places the Concord coach's invention in the same decade as the Erie Canal's completion and the beginning of America's transportation revolution. Downing and Abbott did not simply copy European designs. They synthesized elements from various existing coaches and added their own crucial innovation. Instead of steel springs, they suspended the coach body on leather thoroughbraces. These thoroughbraces consisted of multiple layers of thick bullhide, 3 to 4 inches wide and up to 9 feet long, running from front to rear. The leather straps cradled the entire coach body, allowing it to rock gently back and forth rather than bouncing up and down. The effect, according to Mark Twain, who rode in one during the 1860s, was like traveling in a cradle on wheels. The thorough brace suspension provided three critical advantages. First, it absorbed shocks that would destroy steel springs or break the coach's wooden frame. Second, the rocking motion was easier on horses than the constant jarring of spring-suspended vehicles. Third, leather was repairable in remote locations with basic tools, while broken steel springs required a blacksmith's shop and replacement parts that might be hundreds of miles away. The coach body itself was a marvel of joinery. Downing and Abbott built it in an egg shape, curved panels of ash, oak, and hickory, joined without any right angles. The curves distributed stress evenly throughout the structure. The wood was carefully selected and aged. The ironwork, all custom forged in the company's blacksmith shop, reinforced critical stress points without adding unnecessary weight. A finished Concord coach weighed approximately 2,400 to 2,500 pounds, remarkably light for its size and strength. The coaches came in three standard configurations based on passenger capacity. 6 passenger models seated 2 people on each of 3 benches inside. 9 passenger coaches, the most common for Western routes, added a third person to each bench. 12 passenger models crammed 4 people per bench, though this configuration was less popular because it sacrificed comfort even by stagecoach standards. These passenger counts only included inside seating. The flat roof could accommodate additional passengers and luggage. The driver's seat, high at the front, held the driver, and typically 1 or 2 guards when the coach carried valuables. A fully loaded coach in the West might carry 15 to 20 people total, though this created obvious safety issues on steep grades and rough terrain. The cost reflected the craftsmanship. A Concord coach sold for between $1,100 and $1,500 in the 1860s and 70s. For comparison, a worker earning $1 a day would need to work 3 to 4 years, spending nothing to afford one. Wells Fargo, recognizing quality, became Abbott Downing's largest customer. The specifications Wells Fargo requested for its 1867 order of 30 coaches included 3 extra inches of space between the back and middle seats for long-distance passenger comfort, leather flaps enclosing the back boot to secure mail and luggage, extra-large candle lamps for night travel, and fine damask cloth to line the interior roof. The coaches were painted in Wells Fargo's signature red, with yellow wheels and running gear. Gold leaf lettering spelled out Wells Fargo and Company on each door. The order book at Abbott Downing recorded every custom feature in meticulous handwriting. Each coach received its own 3-digit identification number. The factory assigned numbers sequentially, though 5 coaches were pulled from the production line to fill single coach orders for other customers before the Wells Fargo batch was complete. This October 8, 1867 order was increased to 30 coaches, one of the largest orders Abbott Downing ever filled. The shop superintendent directed that the order be done at once. Workers completed 5 coaches in January 1868, 5 in February, 10 in March, and 10 in April. Artist John Burgum painted colorful landscape scenes on each door. Ornament painter Thomas Knowlton added delicate gold leaf scrolls and striping. On April 13, 1868, all 30 coaches were complete. 2 days later, on April 15th, they departed Concord. The Boston and Concord Railroad's steam engine Pembroke pulled out of the rail yard just after noon on April 15, 1868, hauling a train unlike any seen before in New Hampshire. 30 brand-new Concord stagecoaches rode piggyback on flatbed rail cars, their red and gold paint brilliant in the spring sunlight, their doors decorated with 60 unique landscape paintings. Factory workers, town residents, and newspaper reporters crowded the rail yard to witness the spectacle. Local photographer Benjamin Carr set up his camera and captured the entire trainload in a panoramic photograph that Abbott Downing later printed to promote its 85th anniversary in 1898. The sight of 30 coaches traveling together was unprecedented. Newspapers from Maine to Colorado reported on the progress of the train and its unique cargo. A reporter for the Concord Daily Monitor focused on the artistry of the richly ornamented coaches, writing that each door has a handsome picture, mostly landscapes, and no two of the 60 are alike, that they are gems of beauty and would afford study for hours. The train carried those gems of beauty west. The coaches reached Omaha and were deployed across Wells Fargo's 4,000-mile network of stage routes. By 1867, Wells Fargo had consolidated control over virtually all long-distance stagecoach operations in the West. The company had purchased Ben Holliday's Overland Mail Express in 1866, absorbing the central route that had replaced the Southern Butterfield route after the Civil War began. This consolidation created the largest stagecoach company in the world, with operations spanning from the Mississippi River to California. The economics of this operation were staggering. A single route required relay stations every 15 to 20 miles, each station stocked with fresh horses. The average route employed dozens of drivers, station keepers, guards, and hostlers. Feed for the horses was a constant expense, as was maintenance on the coaches and stations. Small independent companies could survive if they secured lucrative mail contracts or operated short, profitable routes between mining camps and railroad depots, but the long transcontinental routes required capital that only a few companies possessed. Wells Fargo's dominance was not just about money, it was about trust. Miners and merchants and settlers needed to believe that their gold and mail-in cash would actually arrive. Wells Fargo's reputation for reliability, for actually delivering what it promised to carry, gave it a competitive advantage that independent operators could not match. The company's green treasure boxes became synonymous with secure transport. These boxes, constructed of ponderosa pine, oak, and iron, measured roughly 2 feet long by 1 foot wide by 1 foot deep. They weighed between 100 and 150 pounds when filled with gold, coin, and valuables. Wells Fargo bolted them beneath the driver's seat or inside the rear boot of the coach. Passengers' belongings traveled in separate storage compartments, but the treasure box was the valuable cargo, the payload that justified the armed guards and the substantial expenses of operation. Between 1848 and the 1870s, California produced hundreds of millions of dollars worth of gold. That gold had to travel from remote mining camps to San Francisco, and much of it traveled in Wells Fargo treasure boxes on Concord stagecoaches. The men who drove these coaches were skilled professionals, not folk heroes. They had to manage teams of 4 to 8 horses, navigate roads that were often barely distinguishable from the surrounding landscape, maintain schedules despite weather and breakdowns, and protect their cargo and passengers in the event of attack or accident. The pay was decent by frontier standards, roughly $60 to $100 per month, but the work was grueling and dangerous. Drivers worked in relay fashion, typically handling a single leg of 30 to 50 miles before handing off to the next driver at a relay station. On the longest routes, a passenger might encounter a dozen different drivers on a single journey from Missouri to California. This relay system was essential to maintaining speed. Horses could only sustain stagecoach pace for a few hours before needing rest. By keeping the coach moving and swapping out teams frequently, the stage lines could maintain average speeds that would have been impossible with a single team making the entire journey. The central overland route in the 1860s, following roughly the same path that Interstate 80 does today, covered about 1,900 miles from Atchison, Kansas to San Francisco. At 80 miles per day, the journey took approximately 25 days. This was significantly faster than wagon train travel, which typically took 4 to 6 months to cover similar distances. For passengers who could afford the fare, the time savings justified the cost and discomfort. Advertisements for Wells Fargo stagecoaches in 1867 listed a 15-day journey between Sacramento, California, and Omaha, Nebraska, though this optimistic schedule often stretched to 18 or 20 days in practice. The Pony Express, which operated from April 1860 to October 1861, managed the trip in 10 days by using single horsemen riding at breakneck speeds between relay stations spaced every 10 to 15 miles. But the Pony Express carried only mail, not passengers or cargo, and it lost money on every run. It was a publicity stunt that became a legend, but it was never a sustainable business. The stagecoach, by contrast, was profitable. It carried passengers, mail, express freight, and occasionally light cargo. The diversified revenue streams, combined with government mail subsidies, made stagecoach operation financially viable in ways the Pony Express never achieved. The routes varied in profitability and danger. Short runs between established towns were relatively safe and predictable. The Phoenix to Prescott run in Arizona, called the Black Canyon Line, covered 100 miles and cost passengers about $10 one way. The route made stops at a dozen small settlements and relay stations. Depending on the day and the schedule, passengers could expect the journey to take slightly more than 24 hours. By contrast, the routes through truly remote territory, through desert where water was scarce and relay stations days apart, those routes tested both equipment and endurance. The Butterfield route through southern Arizona required over 4 days and 27 stage stops just across the territory. Summer heat made daytime travel nearly unbearable. Winter storms occasionally closed routes entirely. Spring floods turned river crossings into life-threatening gambles. Yet the coaches ran. They ran because there was no alternative, because the West's economy depended on the movement of mail and money and people, because the entire apparatus of American expansion required these wheeled boxes drawn by horses to function as the circulatory system of the frontier. The thorough brace suspension that made Concord coaches successful also made them targets. The coaches were expensive. The cargo was valuable. The routes passed through isolated territory, where law enforcement was scarce or non-existent. Robbery was not just possible, but, from an economic standpoint, almost inevitable. Between 1870 and 1884, Wells Fargo documented 313 stagecoach robberies, 23 burglaries of company offices, and 4 train robberies. These numbers come from an official report published by Wells Fargo Chief Detective James B. Hume and Special Agent John N. Thacker on January 1, 1885. The report summarized 14 years of losses. Total financial damage exceeded $415,000 in stolen treasure, with an additional $513,000 paid out in rewards, legal fees, and guard salaries. For context, $415,000 in 1884 had a purchasing power equivalent to roughly $13 million today. That was the direct cost. The indirect costs in damaged reputation and customer fear and increased security expenses were harder to quantify, but no less real. Wells Fargo responded by building a private police force. The company hired detectives to track down robbers and shotgun guards to protect shipments in transit. The shotgun guards rode beside the driver on high-value runs, armed with short-barreled shotguns loaded with buckshot. These weapons were devastating at close range and essentially useless beyond 20 yards, which made them ideal for defending a stagecoach. A guard could fire at an approaching bandit without risk of hitting a retreating driver or panicked horses. Among the more famous guards were Robert H. Paul and the Earp brothers, Wyatt and Morgan, who worked for Wells Fargo in Arizona Territory during the 1870s. But most guards were anonymous men earning decent wages to sit exposed on a high seat with a shotgun across their knees, alert for trouble that might never come or might arrive suddenly from behind rocks or trees. The most famous stagecoach robber of the era was Charles E. Bowles, who operated under the name Black Bart. Between July 1875 and November 1883, Bowles robbed Wells Fargo stages 28 times across Northern California and Southern Oregon, taking approximately $18,000 over his 8-year career. These numbers are precise because Wells Fargo kept detailed records and because Bowles was eventually caught, tried, and convicted. What made Black Bart unusual was not the frequency of his robberies, though 28 was impressive, but his method and style. He worked alone and on foot. He was deathly afraid of horses and refused to ride them. After each robbery, he fled on foot, sometimes covering 60 miles through wilderness before pausing. He never fired his shotgun, which investigators later learned was usually unloaded. He never cursed or used foul language except in his poems. His demeanor was polite, almost courteous. He would step from cover, brandish the shotgun, and ask the driver to throw down the treasure box. Then he would order the driver to move the coach forward, out of sight over a hill or around a bend, while he broke open the box and extracted the contents. Passengers were rarely robbed. Bowles later explained that he targeted Wells Fargo specifically, not the ordinary people riding in the coaches. His first authenticated robbery occurred on August 3rd, 1877, when he stopped a stage traveling from Point Arena to Duncan Mills in California. At the scene, he left a poem written on a piece of paper and signed Black Bart, the P08, the latter being his phonetic rendering of poet. The poem read, "I've labored long and hard for bread, for honor, and for riches, but on my corns too long you've tread, you fine-haired sons of bitches." The poem ensured his fame. Newspapers across California reprinted it. The public, already fascinated by stagecoach robberies, now had a robber who wrote poetry. The fact that Bowles only left 2 poems at his 4th and 5th robberies did not diminish the legend. He became Black Bart the poet, the gentleman bandit, the cultured outlaw who never harmed anyone and left literary calling cards. The reality was more mundane. Bowles was a middle-aged man, possibly a Civil War veteran, who had failed at mining and turned to robbery as a more reliable source of income. He was methodical, patient, and smart. He studied stage schedules and routes, choosing ambush spots carefully. He varied his timing, sometimes hitting 2 stages within 24 hours, then waiting months before the next robbery. He never established a predictable pattern. Wells Fargo detective James B. Hume spent years trying to catch him. Hume was competent and persistent, and he eventually succeeded, but not through detective brilliance. Bowles made a mistake. On November 3rd, 1883, during his 28th robbery near Funk Hill in Calaveras County, the stage driver, Reason E. McConnell, managed to fire several shots at the fleeing robber with a borrowed rifle. One bullet grazed Bowles's hand. In his haste to escape, he dropped a handkerchief at the scene. The handkerchief bore a laundry mark, FX07. Hume contacted nearly 90 laundries in San Francisco before tracing the mark to Ferguson and Biggs California Laundry, which identified the customer as Charles E. Bolton, a well-dressed mining engineer who lived in a respectable boarding house. Bolton was arrested on November 12, 1883, 9 days after the final robbery. He initially denied everything, but eventually confessed when confronted with evidence. He pled guilty on November 21st and was sentenced to 6 years in San Quentin prison. He served 4 years and was released in January 1888 for good behavior. His health had deteriorated in prison. He was visibly older, his eyesight was failing, and he had gone deaf in one ear. When reporters asked if he planned to return to robbery, he smiled and said he was through with crime. When asked if he would write more poetry, he laughed and replied that he had already said he was through with crime. He never returned to his wife, who lived in Missouri. The last confirmed sighting of Charles E. Bowles was February 28, 1888. He disappeared into anonymity and legend. Black Bart's story illustrates the paradox of stagecoach robbery. It was, from a criminal's perspective, a relatively low-risk, moderate-reward endeavor if done intelligently. The stages traveled predictable routes through isolated terrain. Many carried substantial valuables. Armed resistance was inconsistent. Most drivers, faced with a shotgun, would throw down the chapeau, treasure box, rather than risk their lives, or their passengers' lives, for Wells Fargo's money. At the same time, the rewards were limited. $18,000 over 8 years averages $2,250 per year. Decent money for the 1870s, but hardly a fortune. And the risk, while lower than popular mythology suggests, was real. A single mistake, a dropped handkerchief, was enough to end Bowles's career and land him in prison. For Wells Fargo, robbery was a cost of doing business, like horse feed or station maintenance. The company factored it into their pricing and insurance. They hired guards and detectives to minimize losses. They offered rewards for information leading to convictions. They prosecuted whenever possible, not just to recover stolen property, but to deter future robberies. The system worked, imperfectly. Robberies continued throughout the stagecoach era, but they never threatened Wells Fargo's fundamental viability as a business. The real threat came not from bandits, but from technology. The first transcontinental railroad was completed on May 10, 1869, when the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads joined at Promontory Summit in Utah. The event was celebrated with a golden spike and nationwide publicity. The immediate impact on stagecoach operations was significant but not catastrophic. Railroads did not instantly reach every mining camp and frontier settlement. For decades after 1869, stagecoaches continued to operate on short runs connecting railroad depots to areas the rails had not yet reached. But the long transcontinental routes, the multi-day journeys from Missouri to California, those ended quickly. A trip that took 3 to 4 weeks by stagecoach could be completed in less than 70 hours by train, roughly 3 days. The speed advantage was overwhelming. So was the comfort. Train passengers sat in cushioned seats in enclosed cars. They could stand and walk during the journey. They could eat in dining cars and sleep in sleeping cars. The ride was smooth compared to even the best stagecoach. The cost was lower per mile. Railroads could carry far more passengers and cargo per trip, achieving economies of scale that stagecoaches could never match. Wells Fargo adapted. The company had always operated both express and banking services. As railroads expanded, Wells Fargo shifted focus, using trains to transport the treasure boxes that had once traveled by stage. The company's express business actually grew in the railroad era because trains moved more cargo faster and more cheaply than stagecoaches ever could. But the iconic image of the red and gold Concord coach thundering across the landscape, that image belonged to the past. Short-run stagecoach operations persisted well into the 20th century in some areas. The last Wells Fargo stage carrying cargo ran in 1909 between Tonopah and Manhattan in Nevada. A few coaches operated in remote mountain areas and national parks through the 1910s, often as tourist attractions rather than practical transportation. By 1918, stagecoach service had effectively ended everywhere that automobiles and trucks could operate. The technology that had defined American transportation for decades became obsolete in less than a generation. Back in Concord, New Hampshire, Abbott Downing Company faced the same obsolescence. The partnership between J. Stephen Abbott and Lewis Downing had dissolved amicably in 1847, with both men continuing to build coaches under separate companies. They reunited in 1865 when Lewis Downing retired and his sons joined with Abbott to form Abbott, Downing and Company. The company incorporated in 1873. At its peak, it employed over 300 workers and occupied 6 acres in downtown Concord. The factory produced not just stagecoaches, but dozens of other vehicle types. Ambulances, gun carriages during the Civil War, hotel wagons, tourist vehicles for mountain resorts, streetcars, and dozens of styles of commercial and pleasure carriages all bore the Abbott Downing name. But stagecoaches were the company's identity and its primary revenue source. As demand declined, the company struggled. Between 1827 and 1899, Abbott Downing produced more than 3,000 Concord stagecoaches. Of those thousands, fewer than 160 survive today. Most were simply worn out, used until they broke, then scrapped for parts or abandoned. In 1909, Abbott Downing declared bankruptcy. The company reorganized briefly, attempting to transition to motor vehicle production. In 1912, local investors resurrected the operation, producing trucks and fire engines. The Abbott Downing Truck and Body Company operated through the 1920s, but it never achieved the success of the stagecoach era. The company finally dissolved in 1925. The name was sold to Wells Fargo, which still owns it. The factory buildings were demolished in 1971. Only one structure remains, the blacksmith shop from around 1860, which now houses an American Legion post. A New Hampshire historical marker erected in 1979 marks where the factory once stood. Why did the Concord coach succeed? The answer is rooted in engineering, economics, and timing. Engineering first. The thorough-brace suspension was not a minor improvement over existing designs. It was a fundamental reimagining of how to connect a heavy box to wheels and axles. By using leather instead of metal springs, Downing and Abbott created a suspension system that was simultaneously more comfortable for passengers, easier on horses, more durable in rough terrain, and more repairable with basic tools. The egg-shaped body was brilliant structural engineering. Curved panels distributed stress evenly. There were no weak corners where right-angled joints could fail. The careful selection and aging of wood, the custom ironwork, the attention to detail in every component, these factors meant that a Concord coach could survive conditions that would destroy inferior vehicles. Wells Fargo and other large operators bought Concord coaches not because they were cheap, but because they lasted. A coach that cost $1,400 but operated for 10 years was cheaper over its lifetime than a coach that cost $800 but broke down after 3 years. Economics second. The Concord coach arrived at exactly the right moment in American history. The discovery of gold in California created sudden, urgent demand for transportation infrastructure in a region that had almost none. Traditional wagon trains were too slow for the mail and express business. Light, cheap coaches could not survive the roads. The Concord coach hit the sweet spot, durable enough for Western conditions but fast enough to meet mail contract requirements. The fact that the coaches were built in New Hampshire and shipped west by rail, that detail is important. Abbott Downing was not a frontier company improvising with local materials. It was an established Eastern manufacturer with access to skilled labor, quality materials, and distribution networks. The company could build to consistent standards and maintain quality control. When Wells Fargo ordered 30 coaches, it got 30 coaches that were essentially identical, built to the same specifications. That consistency was valuable in itself. Timing. Third, the Concord coach dominated Western transportation for exactly 2 decades, from roughly 1850 to 1870. Those 20 years were the window between the California Gold Rush, which created demand, and the Transcontinental Railroad, which satisfied that demand more efficiently. If the railroad had arrived 10 years earlier, the Concord coach might have remained a regional New England product. If gold had been discovered a decade later, after railroads had begun expanding west, the coach might never have achieved its iconic status. But the timing aligned perfectly. The coach was mature and proven when demand exploded. It had 2 full decades to establish its reputation before superior technology arrived. What the Concord coach could not overcome was physics. Horses are slower than trains. Leather suspension, however clever, cannot compete with steel rails and steam engines. The economic advantages of railroads were overwhelming, as was the comfort advantage. No amount of engineering could make a stagecoach competitive with a train. The mythology persisted long after the reality had ended. Hollywood westerns in the 20th century presented stagecoaches as under constant attack, racing through hostile territory with arrows and bullets flying. The reality was more mundane. Most trips were boring. The discomfort was chronic rather than dramatic. Robberies happened, but were relatively rare given the thousands of trips completed annually. The real drama was economic. The massive capital required to operate these routes, the precision logistics needed to maintain schedules, the financial risk of any disruption. None of this makes good cinema, which is why the mythology diverged so sharply from the documented reality. Black Bart became a folk hero precisely because he was unusual. Most stage robbers were hardened criminals who used violence when convenient. Bowles's politeness and poetry, his refusal to harm anyone, his solo operation on foot, these details made him anomalous enough to be interesting. The fact that Wells Fargo's 1885 report documented 313 robberies over 14 years means that roughly 22 robberies per year occurred system-wide across thousands of route miles. Each robbery was dramatic for the people involved, but system-wide the rate was actually quite low. Most coaches arrived safely. Most treasure boxes delivered their contents intact. The system worked, which is exactly why it was profitable. The immediate consequences of the Concord coach's success were economic. Abbott Downing became one of New Hampshire's major employers, and Concord became internationally known for its coaches. Wells Fargo built a transportation empire, dominated Western express and banking, and survived the transition to rail transport by adapting its business model. The coaches themselves facilitated California's integration into the national economy. Gold could flow east, manufactured goods could flow west. Mail maintained communication between frontier settlements and the rest of the country. Settlers could travel to remote areas, knowing that they could, if necessary, send a letter that would actually arrive. The stagecoach network created the preconditions for everything that followed: the railroad expansion, the full settlement of the West, the extraction of natural resources, the establishment of towns and cities. None of this was inevitable. It required capital, organization, skilled manufacturing, and a vehicle robust enough to survive the conditions. The longer-term legacy is more complex. The Concord coach became a symbol, a shorthand in American culture for westward expansion and frontier life. Wells Fargo recognized this early. In 1928, the company purchased a historic Concord coach for its museum collection. In the 1930s, the bank opened its first Wells Fargo History Museum in San Francisco, featuring stagecoach number 186 as the centerpiece. School groups toured the museum. The stagecoach appeared in company advertising, in parades, in Hollywood films. In 1962, Wells Fargo redesigned its corporate logo to feature a stagecoach silhouette. The image communicated reliability, tradition, and connection to Western history. In 2012, when Wells Fargo created a boutique banking service for ultra-high net worth clients, they named it Abbott Downing, explicitly invoking the craftsmanship and quality associated with the coaches. This symbolic legacy obscured important realities. The stagecoach era was brief, expensive, uncomfortable, and sometimes dangerous. It was not a golden age of travel. It was a necessary interim solution to a transportation problem, a solution that worked for 2 decades before being rendered obsolete. The coaches that survive in museums today are restored showpieces, paint refreshed, leather renewed, interiors pristine. They bear little resemblance to the working vehicles that carried passengers and gold across rutted roads, vehicles caked in dust, wheels constantly repaired, upholstery worn through by thousands of travelers. The tourist stagecoaches that operate today in places like Old Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts offer carefully controlled experiences, short rides on maintained paths, theatrical recreations rather than actual transport. This is historical preservation, which is valuable, but it is not the same as understanding the historical reality. The stagecoach network also had environmental costs that went largely unexamined in its time. Relay stations required constant supplies of hay and grain for horses. In some desert regions, this meant hauling feed over long distances at considerable cost and environmental impact. Water wells were drilled, sometimes depleting local aquifers. Stations attracted settlement, which brought hunting pressure and habitat disruption. None of this was unique to stagecoaches. Any transportation system would have produced similar effects. But the mythology of the Wild West rarely acknowledges that westward expansion had environmental consequences visible even in the 1860s and 70s. The abandonment of stage routes left a scattered trail of ruins. Relay stations, built quickly from local materials, decayed rapidly once abandoned. Some were cannibalized for lumber. Others simply collapsed. A few survive as historical sites or have been restored, but most vanished. The economic model of stagecoach operation required constant maintenance. Once the coaches stopped running, the entire infrastructure became worthless. Buildings without purpose decayed. This was not tragic. It was the natural consequence of technological change. But it illustrates how completely the railroad transformed Western transportation. The old system did not just become inefficient, it became irrelevant. The drivers and guards and station keepers found other work or moved elsewhere. Some became railroad employees. Others shifted to ranching or mining or retail. A few became local legends, celebrated in small towns for their years handling the reins of a Concord coach. But their skills, developed over years of practice, became obsolete. A stage driver's ability to manage a 6-horse team meant nothing in an era of steam locomotives and, soon after, automobiles. Specialized knowledge, hard-won and valuable, became unmarketable within a single generation. May 1868. 30 red and gold Concord stagecoaches arrive in Omaha, Nebraska, transported by rail from New Hampshire. They are deployed across Wells Fargo's western routes, assigned to specific lines based on terrain and anticipated usage. Each coach is assigned its 3-digit number, recorded in company ledgers. Over the next decade, some will be robbed, others damaged in accidents and repaired. A few will wear out from constant use and be scrapped for parts. In November 1883, Black Bart is arrested in San Francisco, betrayed by a laundry mark on a handkerchief. He serves 4 years in San Quentin, is released, and vanishes. His 28 robberies netted $18,000, approximately $2,000 per robbery on average. Wells Fargo lost that money but continued to operate, continued to profit, continued to dominate Western Express service. The robberies were dramatic but financially minor. In 1909, the last Wells Fargo stagecoach carrying commercial cargo completes its run in Nevada. The driver steps down. The horses are unhitched. The coach, having served its purpose, is stored somewhere or sold to someone or simply left to weather until its wood rots and its ironwork rusts. By 1925, Abbott Downing Company has dissolved. The factory is closed, the workers scattered. The buildings will stand for a few more decades before demolition. Of the more than 3,000 Concord stagecoaches produced over 70 years, fewer than 160 survive. This is approximately a 5% survival rate, which seems low until you consider that these were working vehicles subjected to extraordinary stress. The fact that any survived is remarkable. The survivors reside in museums. The Henry Ford Museum in Michigan, the Smithsonian in Washington, Wells Fargo museums across the country, various historical societies, and private collections. Some are restored to pristine condition. Others are preserved as found, showing honest wear. Each surviving coach has a story, though most of those stories are lost. We know that coach number 186 was built by Lewis Downing and Sons in the late 1840s, that it operated in New Hampshire, first for the Atlantic House and Farragut House hotels in Rye, carrying tourists from the train depot for $2,000 in 1860s currency, that George Colegrove and Henry C. Ward later used it on their Santa Cruz mountain route in California, that Wells Fargo eventually acquired it, and that it became the centerpiece of the company's historical museum. But most coaches have no such provenance. They were tools, used until broken, then discarded. The historical record is incomplete because no one thought to preserve it systematically. The stagecoach seemed permanent when it dominated Western transportation. The idea that it would vanish within decades probably seemed absurd to the drivers and manufacturers and passengers of the 1860s. Yet within 40 years, the last commercial runs had ended. Within 60 years, the manufacturing had ceased. Within a century, the vehicles had become museum artifacts, objects of nostalgia rather than instruments of commerce. What remains is mythology and a few physical survivors, and the knowledge, if we choose to examine the historical record, of precisely how the system actually worked. 3,000 coaches built over 70 years, 28 robberies by one man over 8 years, 30 coaches on one train in April 1868, £2,500 per coach, $60 in Lewis Downing's pocket in May 1813. These numbers are not poetry. They are the structure beneath the mythology, the documented reality of how leather thoroughbraces and egg-shaped oak bodies briefly conquered the American West, carrying passengers and gold and mail across 2,000 miles of rough roads in the narrow window between the wagon trains and the railroads, before steam and steel made even the finest horse-drawn vehicles obsolete.